Hello, I am Indranil Dutta, and I will be talking about how to identify those who are vulnerable to poverty. This is a joint work with James Foster and Ajit Mishra, and this work, particularly this presentation, has been prepared for the International Economic Association meetings in 2021. Vulnerability to poverty typically refers to the probability of becoming poor in the future, which might be due to exposure to different kinds of shocks. And these shocks might be economic shocks, where one loses their jobs, or can be natural shocks like floods or drought, or can be health shocks. So when we think about measuring vulnerability, there are two aspects to it. And here we borrow these concepts from the existing literature on poverty and multidimensional poverty. First is the identification aspect. Here we want to know who the vulnerable are. So there has to be some mechanism of identifying the vulnerable. Without that, we cannot go to the second step, which is about aggregation. Once we know who the vulnerable are, then we can use different aggregation rules to find the level of vulnerability in the country or society. Most studies on vulnerability do not address the identification issue. So why is the identification part important? In this context, with vulnerability, first we not only have to identify the poor, but now we also have to identify the vulnerable. Remember, we are talking about vulnerability to poverty. So first, identification obviously is whether the person is going to become poor or not. And then there, on top of it comes the idea of identifying whether they are vulnerable or not. And Kakwani, in his paper in 2003, showed that inconsistency in the identification of the poor can lead to very counterintuitive results. So identification is important. In this context, in our context, very rich people may also be considered as vulnerable. For instance, if we think of vulnerability to poverty as probability of being poor in the future, there can be some situation where people like Bill Gates can be poor too. So an extreme situation, for instance. So if we do not have any kind of cutoffs or any kind of identification process in our vulnerability calculation, those people might also be included, and we don't want that. We want to include this, we want to take out, we want to exclude people who are extremely rich and who in very extreme situation may also become poor. So as mentioned before, without an identification step, we can't proceed further. So we need to have that identification, some rule, some cutoff to identify who the vulnerable are. In this paper, we explicitly address the issue of identification in vulnerability measurement. We axiomatically characterize different identification rules. We also characterize a class of measure of vulnerability. This is part of the aggregation methods used in the literature and quite commonly used. And we also provide an empirical application of our proposed methods of identification. Given the time constraints for this presentation, I will take you through an example to show you what we are doing in this paper. So consider a society of 3 individuals who are facing health shocks, natural shocks, and law and order shocks. The vulnerability matrix here brings together all the information about these different shocks that individuals face. So individual 1 here faces with probability 0.3 a health shock, with probability 0.6 a natural shock, and with probability 0.1 a law and order shock. The second number here in the cell represents the depth of poverty. So this is the normalized income shortfall faced by individual 1 for the health shock, if the health shock happens. So you can have the depth of poverty here lying between 0 and 1. We can also see this matrix as representing different states of nature. So in one state of nature, health shock happens. In another state of nature, natural shocks happen. We can increase the different states of nature to include where multiple shocks are happening together. So individuals' probability and depth of poverty over the different shocks can be represented through lotteries. When it comes to identifying the vulnerable, most of the literature uses a union-based approach where an individual is considered vulnerable if there is any possibility of being poor in the future. Similarly, there is another approach which would be the intersection approach, which only identifies those individuals as vulnerable who are certain to be poor in the future. Now, if you had noticed the way we had presented the problem here, the measurement of vulnerability here, it has a lot of similarities with the multidimensional literature, because the different states of nature or the different shocks can be considered as different dimensions. The probability of a shock occurring can be thought of as the weights associated with those dimensions. So given these structural similarities between multidimensional deprivation or multidimensional poverty and vulnerability, we can use the dual cutoff methods which have been proposed by Alkire and Foster 2011, and before that also by Foster in 2007 in the context of chronic poverty. So we will use these dual cutoffs to distinguish between identification and aggregation methods. To identify vulnerable individuals, we create an identification matrix where the second value of each cell is either 1 or 0, and 1 representing the positive shortfall in that state in the vulnerability matrix. Our vulnerability function rho E is the weighted sum of deprivation for each individual, where weights are the probabilities associated with each state and the deprivation is the 0, 1 value we get from the identification matrix. Hence, individual 1 has a rho E value of 0.4, individual 2 has rho E value of 0.7, and individual 3 value of 1. If we decide on a cutoff of rho E equal to 0.5, that means only individuals with rho E greater than 0.5, greater or equal to 0.5 would be considered as vulnerable. Then the two individuals who are vulnerable are individual 2 and individual 3. In our model, individual one is not vulnerable. Once we identify the vulnerable, we can calculate their level of vulnerability using the standard FGT indices, where the probability and the deprivation for the different states for each individual are given by the vulnerability matrix. Individual 1 is not identified as vulnerable and hence has value 0. For individual 2 and individual 3, using the vulnerability matrix, we calculate their level of vulnerability, and the societal vulnerability is a simple average of the level of vulnerability faced by each individual. In this paper, we conceptualize and axiomatically characterize a new way to identify the vulnerable, and we use the common structural similarities between vulnerability measurement, multidimensional poverty indices, and chronic poverty to do that. Thank you.